an addict called Vito. Hi, family. First of all, I'd like to thank the committee for asking me to come here and share. That's always a privilege. It's an honor to speak for the fellowship that gave me a life. Because when I crawled out of that last dumpster, I was dead. And I'd like to thank my higher power, because without that higher power, none of this would happen. And of course, I'd like to thank Narcotics Anonymous, because without rooms like this and people like you, I would have no life at all. I would have been dead a long time ago. I grew up in a place called the Bronx. A lot of homies here. And it's the only part of New York that has "the" in front of it, because it's holy ground. Sorry, Brooklyn. And, you know, I came from a one-parent family back in the early 1940s, and that just didn't happen in Latin families. There was no such thing as divorce. And my mother was one of the first independent, proud women before the woman movement come, because she didn't take any money from my father, and he wouldn't have paid anyway. She wouldn't go on welfare. She was too proud. She worked 3 jobs to keep things going. And she thought she was doing the right thing. But that left me on the streets at a very young age. Now, I could probably be most people's grandfather here. I was born before the Second World War. It was a long time. And I picked up my first drug in 1944. By the time 1949-50 came, I was mainlining heroin. And I did what I had to do to maintain my habit. You know, I never planned to grow up to be a drug addict. You know, when I was very small, I went through the Catholic school system and the nuns, and I was supposed to be a priest. At least they told me I was going to be one. And the next thing you know, I was hanging out with the older guys in the neighborhood because I wanted to fit in. I didn't feel I belonged to anywhere. My mother was always gone. My father, his drug of choice was women, and he was doing his thing. And the guys in the neighborhood made me fit in. I became part of. I became the neighborhood clown. I would do what they want me to do so I could fit in, I could be somebody. And the first drug I picked up was the drug alcohol, because they rewarded me for doing the errands and so forth. And next thing around, I was walking around with a handkerchief dipped in carbona, which is cleaning fluid, sniffing all day long. And by the time I was 10 years old, that needle was my arm, and a love affair happened. And things were happening to me that I didn't know could happen to people. I didn't know what was wrong with me. I remember we were playing poker, and one of my friends, his father was a super. And if you guys aren't from New York, a super is somebody who gets a free apartment. They take care of the building. And they usually have the apartment in the basement. And we were playing poker there, and one of our friends was in the corner by himself playing another game called Russian roulette. And he won. He blew his brains out. And those of us that were there, the only feeling that we felt was annoyance. We had to move the game somewhere else. Today I can look back and know my feelings were froze. I didn't have the capability of feeling anything. And for the first day I picked up and used, I used every day until 1956. I got involved in a gun battle in a place called Orchard Beach. And those from the Bronx know the place very well. Everybody had their own sections. And when the man came, we threw the pieces in the sound. And this was a smart addict. There was some woods there. And I knew on the other side of the woods was City Island. And I could get the bus in City Island, and the man wouldn't catch up with me. And I'd take off through these woods. Well, I'll show you how smart I was. I wound up in the summer New York City Police Department Training Academy. In those days, the rookie cops in New York wore gray uniforms. They may still wear them today. I don't know. Thank you. And all I know is I had all these gray men coming down on me. Now, this was late in the afternoon, and they still had paddy wagons there, and the wagon came, and it took me downtown to Manhattan because it was nighttime, and they had to take me to night court to be arraigned. And I was arraigned that night and thrown in a place called the Tombs, which was an old jail in Manhattan. And I stayed there till the next morning when they transferred me up to Bronx County. And I remember when they were transferring me, I started to get sick. Now, I used every day and made sure I never got sick. And all of a sudden, I was getting sick. I was put in a jail cell, beautiful view over Yankee Stadium, and all I could do was remember that love affair with the toilet bowl. I had pains in my gut that I didn't know could exist. I remember banging my head on the bars to relieve pain in my gut. And the guards would come by and spit on me because addicts were the lowest thing on earth. And I detoxed in that cell. I spent 30 days in that cell, and I was called before the Bronx County District Attorney, and they offered me a deal. Us addicts, we seem to find enablers. They said, Vito, if you would leave the state of New York, we'll offer you probation. So I immediately moved to Jersey City. Now, those of you familiar with the tri-state area, you know there's the tubes, the subway that runs between Jersey City, Journal Square, and Manhattan. So I still was in the city on a daily basis. But I was clean. And I figured now that I was clean, I could be the person I always wanted to be. I always wanted to be a good gangster and a dealer. And my boyhood heroes were people like James Cagney, Humphrey Bogart. I wanted to be a wise guy like them. The only trouble is I used all my own stuff. And couldn't stay clean enough to be a good thief. So I figured now I could be a good thief. I'll only use on weekends. And that lasted for 2 weeks, and I was on a 4-year run. During that 4 years, most of it was a blackout. I know I slept on riverbanks, railroad tracks, under people's porches, but it came to an end on February 14th, 1960, in a gutter in a place called Brick Church Station in East Orange, New Jersey. It was cold, it was snowing, I was lying in the gutter, and people were stepping over me like I didn't exist. And most of us in this room know what it means to be a non-person in front of a lot of people. Finally, somebody had enough compassion to call an ambulance, and they took me to the hospital. And when I got there, the same thing happened to me that happened most of my life. The doctors took one look at me, said, "We can't treat him. Look at him." My body was full of body lice from dirty living, because at the end, I wasn't even capable of stealing. I ate out of a dumpster. I found stale bread in the dumpster, was able to find empty bottles of mouthwash and hair tonic and strain it through the bread to get the alcohol. And I always said alcohol was not something that ever I liked. But I'll tell you, when I couldn't get the drugs anymore, I drank anything. Anything to get that buzz so I wouldn't have to feel. And so the nurses deloused me, and my skin had turned yellow, and they told me I was suffering from both infectious and serum hepatitis, and I was contagious, and I had to go into an isolation ward. And so they put me in there, and they assigned a doctor to me, or I should say half a doctor, because see, I was put into the hospital under a program called service. It's a very fancy word for welfare. So they gave me an intern who hasn't really got all his papers yet. And this guy was from Greece, and he used to come in, he used to talk to me, and, we just seemed to be able to, like radar, seek out these enablers. And he would say to me, well, the man wants to talk to you, and he can't come in here because you're contagious, but we have a place upstairs. When people talk about a place upstairs, be careful. He said, we have a place upstairs for people who are very similar to you, and if you would sign these papers, you could go up there for a while and people would forget about you. And remember, it's still cold out there. Now, I was an addict, but I wasn't dumb. I knew it was warm in the hospital, and they fed me. And April wasn't that far away. And when the nurses brought me upstairs, I immediately stopped and said, you can't put me in here, because I realized where I was. I was in an alcoholic ward. This was before the days of detoxes. And what it was a big room with about 40 beds in it, and everybody wore green hospital gowns, and they sat around and played cards all day long. And I said to the nurse, I said, you can't put me with these sick people. They're a bunch of drunks. They're sick. They can't stop drinking. And she said to me, what about your drug problem? I said, well, that's not really a problem. I can stop anytime I want to. I just don't want to stop. But these people are sick. They can't stop. She said, you got two choices. You either go in here or you go out on the street. And it was snowing that day, and I could see the wind blowing outside, and so I decided to stay. Two things happened in that facility that changed my life. One was I got friendly with a very old man there, and I really got to be cautious how I say that, because I was in my 20s and he was in his 40s, and he was a very old man, and he'd be a kid to me today. And the second thing that happened to me, once a week these people would come in and they'd bring a meeting. And I told the nurses, fine, I'll stay, but I can't go to that meeting because that meeting's for sick people. And she told me the same thing again. You don't have to go to the meeting, you can leave. So I came to the meeting. And it wasn't this fellowship, it was another fellowship. And when they come up there, I was still in the mode where I had to be in the back of the room, my back had to be against the wall. I think the first 7 years of recovery, my back had to be against the wall. I just had that streak thing, no matter where I would be, I positioned myself with my back against the wall. And I would sit there and I'd look at those people, and I sort of thought they were real sick, but on the other hand, I liked the way they seemed to talk and put their life together, and I sort of watched them, but still, I couldn't relate to them because they were sick people and I could stop anytime I wanted to. The sad part was I believed the lie. Then one day, that old man was being discharged from the thing, and he had to go into the back room to put his street clothes on because we wore these green gowns. And when he came out, he was dressed as a Skid Row bum. And I looked into that man's eyes, and I saw there wasn't much difference between me and him. He was a bum, his clothes were all ripped. When I came in, my clothes were all ripped. The only difference between the two of us, he'd go out and get loaded on Thunderbird or Muscatel or Gallo, and I'd get loaded on anything I get my hands on. And I looked into his eyes and realized there wasn't much difference between them. So when he left, I started to listen to the people at the meetings. And I got beyond the substance and got into the feelings. And then it was time for me to leave that facility. I was still homeless. I still didn't know what I was going to do. And they handed me a meeting list, and they said, if you come to these meetings, we have coffee and donuts. When you're homeless, that's a pretty big invite. So that first day I got out, I showed up at a meeting that night, and I walked in, and again, the same thing happened to me that happened all my life. I walked in there, and the first thing they said to me, what are you doing here? These are different people than came in the hospital. They said, this is a closed meeting for alcoholics. You don't look like one of us. Now that fellowship back in 1960, the guys wore jackets and ties, and there was very few women. And they took one look at me with my hair down to my butt, and they said, you don't belong. But I said I was just in this hospital, and they told me I could come here. And they said, you don't belong. This is a closed meeting. And they took the meeting list from me, and they circled meetings that were called open meetings and said, kid, you could go there, but I wouldn't if I was you, because people like you just don't get better. One thing you don't do is tell an addict not to come back. Now, I don't know if I wanted what they had to offer, but I did want to show them that I was as good as them, and I would show up. And I showed up into these big speaker meetings, and I would sit down, and everybody would move across the room. But something was happening there in 1960. There was more and more people like me that started to show up. You know, and we would stand in front of, we would sit together, we would never talk to each other in the meeting, but we would stand outside and we'd have our cigarettes on the front of the church, and, you know, and hey, what's happening, man? That's about as much as we shared with each other. But we knew we belonged to each other. We had that look, that smell. You know what I'm talking about. I don't have to tell addicts about that. But we just stuck together. Then one day I was sitting in the meeting of that fellowship, I think it was either late 1963 or early 64, in the Vailsburg section of Newark, New Jersey, and somebody came up and tapped me on the shoulder by a nickname I had gotten. They said, "Hey, Animal, there's a drug meeting in the back room." Now, I had no idea what a drug meeting meant, but myself and the herd of animals, we went to the back room. And for those of you in this room who are old enough to remember the 1960s, when I got into that room, there was a bunch of people in that room that were different than us street people. There was guys there with long hair, but clean long hair. And they had these white T-shirts on with peace symbols, and the gals all had flowers in their hair and long dresses. They were the hippies, the love children of that generation. And they had told us that they came out of San Diego, California, and they had found recovery there of something called Narcotics Anonymous. And they were going across the United States, and when they would get to a city, they'd flop at a local commune. And for those of you who don't remember communes, they were where people stayed and shared everything. And they would rent a room in the back of the other fellowship, and they would start these meetings called NA. And back then, we didn't have much literature, and the readings were a little bit different than we had today. And we had this off-colored white book. It was almost beige. And they opened up the meeting, and they started to share. And when they started to share, I started to hear my thinking coming out of their mouth. And then they asked us locals to share. And when I heard the guys sharing that sat in the meeting with me, my thinking was coming out of their mouth too. And we spent all this time together and we never talked. And I call that the first day of my life. Because I finally found out that I was not unique and different. I was not insane. There were people like me that thought and did the same things I did. And when these hippies moved on, we started to start local meetings. But back then, in the metropolitan area, there was laws called the Rockefeller laws. If two or more addicts got together, using or not using, you got busted. So we would try to meet in private. But now, we had some clean time, but we had no recovery. We didn't know what that was all about. And finally, we met a few guys that got out of two new facilities in Manhattan, Daytop and Phoenix House, and they were in there for like 60 days, and they came out and says, "Well, we know about this recovery. We can tell you how it works. When somebody comes in and shares, you put them in the hot seat in the center, and everybody confronts them. Next thing you know, chairs and tables are flying all over the place. It was like the turf wars back in the Bronx. But I kept in touch with one of these hippies who had gone back to San Diego. And we used to talk on the phone, and he would say to me all the time, he said, "Hey, Vito, why don't you come out here to the West Coast?" He says, we got NA recovery out here. And I used to say to him, I said, "You don't understand. I can't leave the East Coast. I got to make a living." And he would say to me all the time, "Well, you don't work." I said, "But here in New York, we have this thing called welfare. If you're diagnosed as a drug addict or an alcoholic," and this is back in the old days, it was a good deal. They would send you checks. They would pay you to go to school. You would take the checks and you go to the pool hall and play 9-ball all day long and parlay your money. I said, "I got a job. I get a welfare check." He said, "We got welfare in California too." So I take off, and I think this was early 64, cross country to get to San Diego. And I figured I'd find the land of Narcotics Anonymous. When I got to San Diego, there was only 2 NA meetings in the whole city. One was up on Mission Hill. And I remember the first night we got into the car, and we get into this parking lot, this big Catholic church up on the hill. And the guy said to me, "Now, Vito, when you get out of the car, don't mention NA or Narcotics Anonymous." I said, "I thought we're going to an NA meeting." He says, "We are, but the priest thinks we're AA. He won't rent to addicts." So it shows you how resourceful an addict can be. The other meeting we had was in East San Diego, and our landlords knew exactly who we were. It was the Black Panther Clubhouse. They had no problem with us as long as we paid the rent. The rest of the week we had to go where we had to go, but those of us who went to NA, we stuck together like glue. And we talk about the steps the NA way. Now, I got to tell some stories on me now. Number one, I'm 4.5 years clean. I don't have a sponsor. And people would say to me, well, why don't you have a sponsor? I said, well, it's quite simple. Everybody in the program's too sick. They can't sponsor me. Well, everybody was getting better, people coming in after me, and I was still jonesing on a daily basis. So I got the courage up and I asked this guy if he would sponsor me. He said, yeah, Vito, I'll sponsor you. Where are you with the steps? I got indignant. I said, what do you mean, where am I with the steps? I've heard them read every night for over 4 years. I'm done. There's a few around like that today, too. He says, okay, Vito, tell me about the first step. I said, well, that's simple. I'm powerless over drugs and my life got unmanaged. He said, whoa. He says, where in the first step does it say you're powerless over drugs? So I pick up the paper and it says, we admitted we were powerless over our addiction. I said, addiction, drugs, what the hell's the difference? He said, I'll tell you what the difference is. Drugs is the stuff you put into your body. Addiction is that funny looking thing between your ears. So what are you talking about? You talking about me? He says, yeah. And he says, I know you've never worked the first step. I said, how can you say I never worked the first step? You're on the West Coast, I'm on the East Coast, what do you know about me? He says, well, anybody shows up at a meeting and identifies as a drug addict, an alcoholic, cross-addicted, dope fiend, heroin addict, has never worked the first step. I said, but I don't want everybody to know who I am. He says, as long as you identify by chemicals, you're putting the emphasis on the chemicals. When you identify as an addict, not a drug addict, but as an addict only, you're taking responsibility. He closed my back door because he said addiction is a disease of attitudes, a disease of negativity, a disease of not wanting to deal with life on life's terms. The getting and using is the final end of it. It comes after the disease of addiction. When people relapse, they relapse long before they put a chemical in their body. And he said, I want you to identify as an addict only, and you put the emphasis on that. And it closed my back door, because up to that time I could say it was the drugs, it was the alcohol, it was the family I came through. I could blame it on a million things. But when it lied between my ears, the buck stopped there. And he explained to me that the first step was the things of my past, and the things of my past that I brought into recovery. The next 10 steps would become my future. Not the next 11 steps, but the next 10 steps would become my future. And he said to me, when you work a first step, it's like going out here on the main street and taking all your clothes off and standing there naked. If you stand there too long, something's going to happen. He said the second step is putting on new clothes, and if you stay on the first step too long, something's going to happen. Now, I'm not disagreeing with everybody, I'm just sharing my own personal experience. And when I sponsor guys, they do that first step and get on to a second step. Because the first step leaves them powerless over their disease. The rest of the steps give them power through spiritual principles to be able to live life. And that said, we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. And I informed my sponsor in my infinite wisdom that we will skip 2 and 3 and go directly to 4. He said, why are we going to skip 2 and 3? I said, but you don't understand. I'm different. I'm unique. I'm an agnostic. And I don't get into this God stuff. There was silence for a few minutes. And then he says, Vito, why are you an agnostic and not an atheist? Now, nobody ever asked me that question before, so I had to think. I said, well, it's simple. Just in case I die, because I'm not going to ever die. You know, when you're in your 20s, you're going to live forever. I said, but just in case I die, and there happens to be a God, I want him to know I wasn't one of them atheists who disbelieved with him. I was an agnostic who really didn't know. And he says, truly an addict, always looking with the back door. And he said, I'm going to tell you something. There's no such thing as an agnostic. An agnostic is a chicken atheist. Now, can you imagine your sponsor saying you're chicken? But the obsession to use finally was beginning to be lifted from me, so I wanted to take direction. And what he said to me, he said, there's a difference between a power greater than yourself and your higher power. You don't meet God till the third step, dummy. I said, well, I go to meetings and I hear people talking about a power greater than themselves and a higher power in the same breath. And he said, they're wrong. He says, as a matter of fact, in your addiction, you had a power greater than yourself. How many mornings did you get up and say, I am not going to use today, and within 5 minutes you were cooking up and shooting up? That's a power greater than yourself. But it's a negative power greater than yourself. In recovery, anything that makes you aware of the insanity of doing it over and over again and thinking it's going to come out different would be a power greater than yourself. It could be something you hear somebody share at a meeting, something in the literature, something even an earth person may say, something that makes you stop, take a look at the insanity before it happens and do it different. That is a power greater than yourself. And even someday, if you come to believe in a higher power, that higher power is not going to open the sky, send the angels down, and fix Vito. It's going to work through people, places, and things. And you will always find a power greater than yourself through people, places, and things. And then it was time to move on to that third step. You know, we made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood Him. And I said, we're going to skip this one. That got the G-O-D word. And he says, read the last part of the step. I said, God as we understood Him. He said, dummy, you can have a God of your own understanding. Even a rock in the backyard if it's loving and caring. But I don't even think you're that dumb. Why don't you just take G-O-D and change it to a group of druggies or good orderly direction and let that be the God of your understanding. Because in recovery you can change it anytime you want. And that made sense to me. Then he explained to me why it says God as we understood Him and does not say God as we understand Him. And there's a difference. Because if that step read, God as we understand Him, would mean Narcotics Anonymous would have an understanding of God. But because it says God as we understood Him, then when we walk in that door, we all have a personal God of our own understanding. It gives us that freedom. And then he said, buy a dictionary. Get ready to write. And I informed him in my infinite wisdom that I was born in this country and I need no dictionary. And he said, we'll see. So what I want you to do is to look up the word decision, will, and lives. So I go out and I buy this little pocket dictionary you stick in your back pocket, and I come and I show him. He said, whoa. He said, you might as well throw that in the garbage. I want you to get a collegiate dictionary. I said, that costs money. You don't want me to spend money. He said, get a dictionary. Now the obsession to use was being lifted, so I started to take direction. I went out and bought a Merriam-Webster Collegiate Dictionary, yay thick. And he said, I want you to look up the words decision, will, and life. So I look up the word decision, and I open it up, and there's 5 definitions of that one word. So I called my sponsor. I said, I got the deal now. This Merriam-Webster guy, he was an addict, wasn't he? Because he could pick and choose. He said, dummy, read it, and the one that seems to go with your gut, write about it. And there was one there that talked about decision, a starting point, a place to begin, a commitment. And that seemed to make sense. But see, before I looked up that word, I used to hear the story all the time about the 3 frogs on the logs, and they all 3 made a decision to jump off the log. Which one jumped in the water? None of them. They only had to make a decision. And my sponsor said, that's wrong. He says, a decision without a commitment is doing nothing. He said, those frogs will die on the log. He says, you must make a commitment into its action. And that made sense to me. Then I looked up the word lives, and I had to call my sponsor and tell him I got gypped. Because there's one word was missing from the dictionary. I couldn't find lives. He said, dummy, look under life. It's in the subheading. I thought you knew English. Sure enough, I looked at the subheading. They had adjectives and adverbs and all that other stuff I still don't understand. Anyway, there was one for lives that said things that occur in a lifetime. And that seemed to make sense with the step. But I got a spiritual awakening when I looked up the word will. Because it said your reaction to things that happen in your life. And a light bulb went off, and I sat down and I talked to my sponsor, and he says, yes, that's the problem with addicts. We react. Now we have to learn to respond. And that's one of the magics of the third step. And I said, oh, I get it now. I hear these people go to meetings and they say, turn it over, turn it over. And the next day they come back and do the same thing. And he said, that's not what the step is saying. It's saying, turn it over to the care of. I said, what's the difference? You're playing with words now. He said, no, I'm not, dummy. Let's say someday somebody is dumb enough to get in a relationship with you, and then even dumber enough to have kids with you, and you want to go out on a Saturday night and have a good time. You would hire a babysitter, and you would turn the kids over to the care of the babysitter, not over to the babysitter, because you're going to come back and take your kids back. And that's what you're to do with your higher power, is to turn it over to the care of a higher power, to guide. Because your higher power will never take away from you his most precious gift, free will. And your higher power loves you enough that he will let you feel the consequences of your actions. Because that's how addicts learn. No pain, no gain. Hopefully we stay around long enough that we make the change before the pain. And the steps seemed to make sense, and we did it. And I wanted to be like the other guys in the fellowship that had done their 5th step. So I used to say to my sponsor, don't you think we ought to put me on the 4th step? And he'd say, you're too sick, dummy. Work the first 3 steps. This went on for a long time. Then one day he says, start your 4th step. 24 hours later I called him up and said, I'm done. He said, Vito, if I knew you wanted to go to confession, I would have took you to the Catholic Church. He says, even though the 4th step is part of your history and part of confession, it's much more than that. He said, what I want you to do is I want you to write about relationships. This is before we had a 4th step guide. He said, I want you to write about relationships, resentments, and a whole bunch of different things he gave me. And he said, but I want you to write about from the perspective of how you felt in your addiction when these things were creating. And I want you to write on them thoroughly, get in touch with those feelings of how you felt. When you finish that, I want you to go back and write about the same thing, but how you feel about it today. The first will tell me where you were. The second will tell you where you are today, which I need to know when I put you forward from the 5th step. But he said also, more important than that, it'll show you how much you've grown. Because the last thing an addict ever notices is that there's changes going on. Everybody else in the rooms notices it, but the person making the change never notices. And by writing about the 4th step in that term of how I felt and how I feel today, you can see the growth there. And when it was time to sit down with the 5th step, when we spoke to another human being and God about the exact nature of our wrongs, we made an appointment to go to a place that was pretty barren back in those days. It was called Chula Vista. It was halfway between San Diego and Tijuana. And we sat on some rocks out there in the sort of semi-arid desert. And I had all this writing. I was going to keep my sponsor captive for the next 24 hours. And we started it off, and I started to read, and he says, you ain't reading any of that shit. I said, what do you mean? I worked on this, and I don't remember how long. He says, you're not going to read it. You're going to glance at it and talk about it. He said, remember when you were writing it, and you'd call me up, and you say, I can't do this 4th step. I'm going to use over it. And I used to tell you to call the guys in your network, because that's what the 4th step's supposed to do. Prime the well. Bring it up to the surface. The feelings are supposed to come out. And that's why we use our network. But in the 5th step, we don't read what we wrote because it's not the exact nature. We talk about it, and out of your gut will come the things that are underneath, the exact nature. You may be violent or rageful. All that stuff is the things that are coming out. But what's the exact nature? What is the trigger in there? What is the thing causing it? And by sitting there and glancing at what I wrote, all that stuff came out. And when we finally finished, I looked for this big spiritual awakening I used to hear other addicts talk about. The city sanitation department came, and I feel like a new person. I didn't feel any of that. And I said to my sponsor, the only thing I feel is I want to go to the meeting and announce to the world, I've done a 5th step. I have arrived. And he said, if most people were honest, that's the feeling you get. But the benefits of the 5th step come in the weeks and the months after you do it. You're more in touch with your program. You're more in touch with yourself. You want to grow. That's the magic of the fifth step. And isn't it funny the fifth step, isn't that funny how the sixth step follows it? We were entirely ready to have God remove these defects of character. And this is when this agnostic said to his sponsor, is this where I get on my knees and God takes them away? And he laughed at me and he says, you can get on your knees if you want. But there's nothing in the sixth step that says God removed your defects. It says Vito became entirely ready to let the process begin. He said it's a step of willingness. It's a step of getting entirely ready. You could pray all you want, and that's okay. That's fine. But that step is Vito's step. They prepare himself to get himself ready. And he explained the difference to me between a defect and a shortcoming. Because he said I had to realize there was a difference. Even though they're rooted in the same word. A defect was part of me, part of my personality, just like my addiction. It was part of me. The shortcoming was acting out on the defect. If I don't act out on the shortcoming, the defect is arrested just for today. I was married to a girl that passed away 10 years ago, and she used to always say about the sixth step, she says, sixth step is packing the suitcase, and the seventh step is taking the trip. So I said to my sponsor, how do I get ready to do this sixth step? He says, simple. Take a piece of paper like this, draw a line down the center, this side of the line, write all the defects and patterns we talked about in the fifth step. On this side, just their opposite. Intolerance, tolerant. Impatient, patience. This is where you are. This is where you need to go. This is the roadmap to recovery. You see, everything is on a piece of paper, and I know just the opposites, and this is where I need to go. And then he said, prioritize them. Put them in the order that they're most problems. And he says you use a rifle effect, not a shotgun effect. You know, with a shotgun, when you pull the trigger, the blast goes in all directions. But when you take a rifle, it's straight to the target. And he said, I want you to take a target effect and work on one at a time. Shelf everything else. And when the other one's under control, pull one from the shelf and work on that. And then when he put me on the seventh step, we humbly asked him to remove these shortcomings. I said, is this where God takes them? Can I get on my knees and God does the work? He says, you can get on your knees if you want, but there's nothing there that says God removes them. It said, Vito humbly asked him to remove these shortcomings. Well, I said, well, then how the hell do these shortcomings leave? He said, dummy, what do you think I kept you on the first 3 steps for so long? I said, I don't understand. Because you got to remember, I was pretty much brain dead. I was a little boy in a man's body. And he said, it's very simple. And at that time we talked about something that a lot of men in this program have, and you don't hear them talking about it too much today. But I had it like a lot of men. It's called violent, vicious jealousy. The kind of jealousy where your hands move before your mouth does. Even a female addict doesn't want to get batted around after a while. And I couldn't stay in a relationship. And what he told me, the way God removes that, is when I begin to feel jealous, I go down to a first step. I feel all the feelings of jealousy. I feel myself falling apart. I feel my life totally unmanageable. I don't deny it. I embrace it. I feel it in every part of me. And then I go forward to a second step and see the insanity that I will cause if I act out on those feelings. And then I go to a third step and turn them over to the care of God. And then go back to a second step and do it different. And he said if I go 1, 2, 3 and back to 2, those shortcomings will be removed from me. And I like to say it went away like that, but it didn't. But by working it, I don't think I've had that problem in 40 years. It was relieved through the first 3 steps. And then he had me work on each one of my shortcomings all the way through. But what he didn't tell me is when I finished getting rid of all of them, I got a whole bunch of new ones. And the 6th and 7th step are lifetime processes. Then it was time to move on to that 8th step, where we made the list to all those we had harmed. And I informed him we can't do that because everybody owed me Christmas presents. If they didn't do this, I wouldn't have done this. I says to him, I'll tell you what I'll do. When I become willing, I'll make that list. He said, read the step. I pick it up. And it told me that I became willing. I had to make the list and then become willing. I don't become willing, then make the list. So I said, okay, I'll do it. Because I wasn't dumb enough not to follow directions, because the obsession to use was taken from me, and I had some common sense. So I make the list, and like an addict, once we do something, we go to the other extreme. Now I'm ready to go out and make amends to the whole world. And he said, whoa. He said, what do you think we do it with our sponsors for? Because we need their experience. He said we make direct amends to all those we had harmed, except when to do so would injure them or others. He says you're not going to start making amends and hurting people. You don't go to your grandmother and say, remember when your diamond was gone? Hello. You'll cause more problems that way. We will sit down and we will talk about each one of them, and I will direct you if you need to make direct amends. I will direct you if you need to make anonymous amends, especially if they're financial. I will direct you to do the things that you need to do so you won't hurt somebody else. And then we talked about those faceless people. We've all had them, like two ships passing in the night. And he told me that those amends need to be given up to my higher power. And if my higher power felt a direct amend needed to be made, those people will show up in my life. And when they show up, I'll know why they're there. And I've had people show up as much as 15 years later. There are no coincidences in this thing called recovery. They showed up when I was ready to make those amends. And when they were ready to receive them. Then he explained to me why it says in the step, injure them or others. Who are others? What's that all about? Well, he said, Vito, you're not going to go back to the Bronx, to the 42nd Precinct and say, in 1956, there was a gang rumble at so-and-so, and a few people got stomped, and I don't know, maybe the guy died. Do you have any unsolved murders? I think they would accommodate. They have enough cold cases. He said, that's insane. But you need to make those amends through other ways. You need to give them up to God. You need to go out and work with some kids. You need to do things to help people. You have to make a living amends. And he explained to me that the first 3 steps will keep me physically clean. And steps 4 through 9 will clean me emotionally and spiritually. And he said to me, it is not okay to be physically clean and spiritually dirty. And we know people who are physically clean for a long time and are spiritually dirty. They pitch a tent at the detox store to catch the girls as they come out. Yes, we come in this program to recover. We come in here to stay clean. But we also come to change and grow. And it is not okay just to be clean.
That's right.
And I hear addicts say all the time, well, I'm not using. What do you want from me? I want you to change. That's what it's all about. And he told me steps 10 through 12 are the growth and maintenance steps. I maintain what I got in the first 9 and I grow on top of them. You know, in the 10th step, where we continue to take personal inventory and when we were wrong, promptly admit it. He explained to me that does not mean to say you're sorry. You can if you want. But when you're wrong, promptly admit it means you admit it to yourself. Self-honesty. When you are doing a written 10th step on a nightly basis and are reflecting on that step and you are wrong, you promptly admit it to yourself so that you don't do it again. You see, it's okay in recovery to make mistakes, but it is not okay to keep making the same mistake over and over. And I did a written 10th step for 16, 17 years. I don't do it today, but I did it for 16, 17 years that I was so much in the habit, when I lay my head on the pillow, I reflect through my day. And when I'm wrong, I promptly admit it. But if I didn't write it for that many years, I wouldn't be doing it automatically. And what happens when you do a 10th step, you take the elevator down to the step you need to be on. You take the step down to the 7th step if you need to have something removed, or to the 1st step, or the 4th step, or the 5th step. It takes you down daily to what you need to do. And yet I hear addicts talking about, well, I went through the steps 5 times. Well, damn it, if you went through the steps 5 times, you must not have been doing a good 10th step. Because when you do a 10-step, you go down, you work the other steps over and over again, but you do it on a daily basis. You get rid of that garbage daily instead of every 4 years. That's how you become unspiritually clean. The 11th step, to me, is the cornerstone or keystone of all the steps. It's not number 1, but it's at number 11. Because if you remember, after I did the first step, my sponsor said the next 10 steps would become my future. Because the 11th step is where we sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood Him. Praying only for the knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out. We sought. That means we are seekers. Everybody sitting in this room, everybody who's ever lived the steps of their life is seeking to improve a conscious contact with God as the way they understood Him. Means we have been doing it prior to the 11th step. Because it doesn't say that we make conscious contact with God through prayer. We to improve upon our conscious contact. If you're improving on something, then you've been doing it. And it talks about prayer and meditation. And in our literature it talks about prayer is asking and meditation is listening. But I like to take it one step further. I think meditation is the highest form of prayer there is. Because if there's a conscious contact, all is known. There was a writer that once said that if you don't go within, you go without. And if you think about that statement, it's very important because it's part of our 11th step. It says, praying only for the knowledge of God's will for us. Well, I'll be arrogant enough to say I know what God's will is for me. Because I had a sponsor that told me what God's will was. He said, Vito, God's will today, tomorrow, and 100 years from now will always be the same. For the highest good of all concerned in any situation. And what he told me I needed to do was step out of the box. Become an observer. Take myself and my self-centeredness out of the equation and look at the situation as a neutral party. And say what is best for everybody in that situation. And that will always be God's will for me. You see, my will is to be self-centered, which I get the best feelings out of. But I step out of the box and I really see what's the best for everybody. And that's why at the end of the step they say, after praying for the knowledge of His will, the power to carry it out. Because we got to pray unceasingly for the power to carry it out. Because I may know what God's will for me is. I may know what the highest good for all concerned in the situation is. But my self-centeredness and my disease wants what I feel is best for me. It's going to make me feel good. And that's why I have to constantly pray for the power to carry it out. Because always God's will is not my will. And I need to line my free will up with God's will. And the 12th step says, as a result of these steps, it's the portal to the real world. As a result of these steps, we had a spiritual awakening. What was that spiritual awakening? For me, it's quite simple. These steps work. They're the answer to every problem in life. You know, you hear people talk about doing 12-step work, doing H&I and PI and going to jail and all that. And that's great. But real 12-step work is what the step says. Carrying this message to other addicts. What message? The message that the steps work. And to practice these in all of our affairs. It says it quite simple. As a result of these steps, we had a spiritual awakening. And we try to carry this message to other addicts and practice these principles in all our affairs. So it's telling us the steps are the answer to all of our problems. Now I know there's people sitting here tonight and say, I just lost my job. My relationship just broke up. I'm broke. What the hell do the steps have to do with that? Well, it's really quite simple. The steps is the answer because it will take me through the process to the other side and I don't have to pick up and use. And that's why the steps are always the answer. They won't correct the relationship problem. They'll get me through it till I get into a new relationship that's healthier. Or find another job. Or learn how to pay my bills. But the steps are always the answer. And I have no idea what time I started, so I'll wing it here a little bit. I worked these steps for a long time. I think it was 17 years after I started working the steps after 4 years. And I got to a point where I married a girl at that time whose family came over on the Mayflower, pure blood American. And she would say to me, why do you go to those meetings with those people? If you want to go to meetings, why don't you join the Rotary Club or the Kiwanis clubs? Because by that time, things changed in my life. I worked the program, I got some material things, had a business, had the house, had all those nice things that are the rewards of the recovery. So I figured I graduated from the 12-Step Academy. Your plumb's cured. And you start talking to an addict like that. So, she used to say, you don't need to be with those people. So you cut back to one meeting a week, one meeting a month, and then the ultimate insult to this fellowship. Show up once a year to pick up your chip. Hey, peons, keep coming back. Someday you can come once a year. NA thieves. I was one, so I could say it. See, things were happening with me. My feelings were beginning to freeze. And people would say to me, you need to go to meetings on a regular basis. That's what gave you life. So, hey, I'm different. I got it all now. Then one day the crisis came. I heard the Pied Piper outside my window. And I knew if I left that house, I would never come back again and would die somewhere in the gutter. And I said to myself, if I can make it through the night till the sun comes out, I'm going to be okay. It's called willpower. And we know how good willpower is with X-Lax. So I locked myself in that room. And I remember the pain inside me, the wanting to not feel the situation that was going on in my life was so intense. I wanted to leave. I wanted to get high. I did not want to feel. And the sun came up, and the Pied Piper was still there. And I said to myself, if I'm going to go out and die from this disease, I want the easier and softer way. I tied a rope, put it around my neck, and jumped off a chair. Now, being an addict, I don't get things right. The chair falls from underneath me, my body swings, the weight of my body busts the door open, the girl I'm married to comes and cuts the rope, calls the paramedics, they take me to the hospital, the doctor said, try to commit yourself. And I was living in Pennsylvania at that time, and they had a law there like most states, if you try to take your life, they can commit you for observation for 15 to 25 days. I go up to the 7th floor of Wilkes-Barre General Hospital, the loony ward, and I go through the intake process, and I'm sitting down with this psychiatrist, this female psychiatrist, and we sat and we talked for a while. And she says, Vito, you're a little nuts like most people. But your biggest problem is you're an addict without a program. If I don't commit you to the ward, do you promise to get to a meeting? I ran to a meeting. And the words of my first sponsor were echoing in my head. I can still feel it today. When you're green, you're growing. When you're ripe, you begin to rot. And I became ripe, like a lot of people who hang around here for a while. And I got back into my program, back to going to meetings, back to sponsoring people, back in service. And of course, that marriage didn't last, because she was a blue blood. But she died about 6 years ago as a result of the disease of addiction, where the guy she was married to duct taped her to a chair and beat her because she didn't bring enough money home to support his habit. So the marriage was over, and being an addict, I gravitate towards the fairer sex. And I got involved with this girl in the program, and my excuse was I have known her for 5 years, because she kept coming in and out relapsing for 5 years. And I used to justify, well, she's not really a newcomer, she's a rethread. And I don't recommend it for most people. Fortunately for me, it was something that worked out, because she did get her program together. And I was married to her for 20 years. And she had a great program. And there's some people in this room that know her because she used to go to conventions with me. And we were living in Charlotte, North Carolina. And we used to do this deal on Sunday. We would drive down to Charleston to the beach and we'd walk 10 miles down the beach and 10 miles back up, 20 miles every Sunday. No beepers, no cell phones, no nothing. That was our quality time together that we spent. And she was a very athletic girl. Then one day she couldn't make the walk. She couldn't catch her breath. And when she went to the doctors, they diagnosed her she was in stage 4 cancer, lung cancer. She had another addiction problem called nicotine. And they told her she had 6 months to live. Well, hell, I belong to Narcotics Anonymous and I got a higher power. I don't care what doctors say. We're going to beat this. So she opted to go through experimental chemo, and we were going to do this deal, and she went through 2 phases. Her biggest thing that she feared was losing her hair. And she didn't lose her hair, even though we went out and bought the wig. And the last time after she had the last round of chemo, the doctor wanted her to go to the hospital for x-rays and hand deliver them across the street because his office was right across from the Carolina Medical Center. And we did that, and we brought the x-rays over, and he said, I got some good news for you. The tumors are shrinking on the lungs. So we went out. It was a Thursday. We went out to celebrate. We went out to dinner. And Thursday was my home group. And I got home, and she said to me, she says, I'm going to kick back tonight. I'm not going to the meeting. You go, and I'll see you when I got home. And she gave me a big hug, and she grabbed me, and she says, I really love you, V. I said, yeah, Patty, I love you too. She says, no, I want you to know I really love you. I said, yeah, okay, I know. I'll see you later on. And I go to the meeting. This was about 7 o'clock. And about 9:30 I come home. We had these little French windows alongside the door. Now, my wife, at her older age, she had a little bit of a, I don't know what you want to call it, a peculiarity. She had the empty nest syndrome, so she started bringing home toy poodles. Well, we had 7 toy poodles that slept with us. Beautiful little dogs, and they were all P's. We had Pepe, we had Pablo, we had Paco, they're all P's. And I look in through this friend thing, and the dogs are in a circle, and I see these legs sticking up in the air. So I open the door and I run in. My wife is laying on the floor, her legs straight up, her eyes bugging out of her head. And I grab a washcloth and I wipe her face and try to revive her. I couldn't get nothing, so I call 911. Paramedics come, and they said, did she have any head injuries? And I said, no, she has lung cancer. And I told the story. He says, where's her medication? I said, it's on the table. They gathered it in a plastic bag. They said, we're taking her to Mercy Hospital. Meet us there. So I lock the dogs up, and I get in my car, and I start going towards the hospital. I call some addicts in the program. By the time I got to the hospital, they were sitting in the emergency room waiting for me. And we're sitting there, and the doctors come out and say, look, we don't know what's going on. We have to stabilize her. You just sit here. When we know something, we'll let you know. About 2.5 hours later, the doctor comes back and says, well, here's the story. The cancer metastasized. It went to her brain stem, and it popped, and her brain stem is broken, and she is clinically dead. We have her on life support system. We need you to sign the papers, take her off life support, and let her go. And I grabbed that doctor, and I said, listen, that's my best friend. That's my lover. I said, that's my wife. You fix her. He says, you don't understand. I can't do nothing. And I said, no, you don't understand. I picked him up and threw him across the room. Next thing I know, hospital security is there, and they're taking me out of the hospital. And I go home, and I lay down with the dogs in bed, and for 4 or 5 hours, and I get up, and I go back to the hospital. By this time, she's in intensive care. And they would only let me in once an hour. And I go in, and I grab her by the hand and say, Patty, if you have to go, go, but I cannot let you go. I cannot sign the papers. This went on all the way to 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Then finally a light bulb went off in my hand. I haven't started to pray. The only thing I could see was about my loss and about me. So I went outside the hospital. They had a little meditation garden. And I sat there and went into meditation, and a little scene popped into my head about when we used to go in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. We had a Monday night home group called the Acceptance Group, and we would go in one car, and when the meeting was over, I'm a bullshitter. I love talking to people, and I'd leave that meeting. It'd take me an hour to get out to the car. She wanted to go home and watch TV, and she'd give me that look like, Vito, let's get the F out of here. Till finally she started taking her own car. And that's the look that I saw on her face in the hospital. She was saying, let me go. So I went up to the nurse's station. I said, I'm ready. They said, well, we have to call a doctor. And the doctor came, disconnected her, and she went in 3 minutes with a smile on her face. And then it was over. And I remember I left that hospital and I got to the first traffic light. She had a little sports car and I was driving it while she was in the hospital. And the hood, the convertible top was out. I got to that first traffic light and I took my fist and I just pounded it on the steering wheel. The damn airbag comes out on me. I rip it, throw it in the street, and go on home, and I rip the phone off the wall and I lock all the doors. And you addicts start banging on my door and I wouldn't answer the door. I wanted nothing to do with you folks. Because you promised me I'd be happy, joyous, and free. And I worked the program, and she worked the program. And who the hell is this God to take my best friend away? And as far as I was concerned, I was going to have that funeral, and I was going to go out and get high, and I don't care what happened, because I don't want to live without her. The next morning I got up, I got her clothes together, I went to the funeral parlor, I picked out her casket, arranged the funeral, went to the cemetery. She didn't want to be buried below ground, so I got her a mausoleum. And by the time I pulled back home in my driveway, your cars were in my driveway, on the street. You broke it into my house. You had coffee on, you had food on the table. And I came in and I was angry and said, what the hell are you here for? So we're not here for you, we're here for her. She was our friend. I said, well, fine, you could stay till after the funeral. But I'm going to tell you, out of respect to her and you, I'm not going to use till the funeral's over. But when it's over, I'm going to use. They said, fine, do whatever you want. We're here for her. Funeral came and gone. People all left, except I had this one sponsor. He decided he was going to stay a week. I said, all right, you could stay for the week. But I just want you to know, we're not going to go to any of those damn meetings. Don't talk this step stuff to me. And out of respect to you, I won't use till you leave. He says, fine. He hung around for 5 days, and it was the next day he was taking a plane back up north. He says, I'm leaving tomorrow, Vito. He said, I want you to make me one promise. Now, when a sponsee asks you to make a promise, you know something's coming. I said, what do you got in mind? He says, well, he says, you wouldn't do anything less than what you've asked other people to do. And then here it comes. He says, don't remember every time one of your sponsees would say to you, Vito, I want to go out and use? And I made my mind up and there's no stopping me. And what you would say to them? I said, finish. He says, you would always say, you got my blessing. You can go out and use. You could tell everybody Vito said I can go out and use. You just have to do one thing before you go out and use. Do a 90 and 90. Would you do anything less than what you've asked somebody else to do? So I said, okay, I will do a 90 and 90, and I will prove this program don't work. Well, I did about 140 meetings in 40 days. Because in Charlotte, we were able to start 7 in the morning and go to 1 o'clock at night. And I woke up one morning, and a voice rumbled inside my head and says, you ungrateful SOB. I gave you over 20 years of a good relationship. Some people don't get one day. Who the hell are you to be ungrateful? And instantly my grief turned to gratitude. And I found out what works for newcomers works for old-timers. Because if I didn't hang around to do those 140 meetings in 40 days, I would have went out and used, and I would not have experienced the miracle again. I stayed clean by a thread. And the thing that always kept me going is when somebody challenges my chip on the shoulder and says you can't do something, I do just the opposite. That's how I got clean in the first place, and that's how I stayed clean when I wanted to use. And that's how the miracle of this program. And I'm going to close now. I want to tell one story before I close. There was this guy, his name was Joe Addict. Joe hit a bottom. It was the end for him. He was walking down the street and there was a manhole cover uncovered like they have in the Bronx. And he fell down in it. And you could hear Joe pleading down in that manhole cover, saying, I'm an addict and I'm dying from the disease of addiction and the dragons of hell are at my butt and there's no hope for me and I want to die. And the minister come walking down the street and he heard the street and he looked down there. He said, what's going on down there? Says, me, Joe Attic, and I'm dying from the disease of addiction, and the dragons of hell are here, and I want to die. Minister said, no problem. He pulls out his Bible, says a few prayers over him, says, you're going to be fine, son. And he leaves. But Joe wasn't fine. He was in his agony. He was going on, and he was screaming and hollering, I just want to die. And the doctor's walking down the street, and he hears the commotion. He goes over, he says, what's going on down there? He said, I'm Joe Attic, and I'm dying from the disease of addiction. And the dragons of hell are on my butt, and there's no hope for me, and I just want to die. The doctor says, no problem. He pulls out a script pad, writes a little Oxycontin and a little Percodon. Says, take some of these, you'll be fine, Joe. But none of it helped. It just put him into a deeper state of despair and hopelessness. And he kept crying. Then all of a sudden, this little tiny man comes skipping down the street. His name was Jimmy Kennan. Little man born in the Highlands of Scotland, migrated to Philadelphia, shot heroin under the L on Kensington Avenue, was a roofer by trade, went to Burbank. And he looked down there and he says, what's going on? He says, I'm Joe, I'm an addict, I'm dying from the disease of addiction. I want to die. I want to die, the dragons of hell. And Jimmy jumps down into that manhole cover. And Joe says, what are you, nuts, man? Now there's two of us. There's no hope. There's no escape. There's two of us that are going to die. And Jimmy says, no, I've been here before and I know the way out. Thanks for letting me share.